On a rain-soaked night at the most luxurious restaurant in Manhattan, two worlds that were never meant to cross suddenly collided in a way no one could have anticipated. Maggie Sullivan, a 27-year-old single mother, was hiding her exhaustion behind the flawless mask of a fine dining waitress. Behind her polite smile lay a life of endless double shifts, unpaid rent, and a 9-month-old baby girl waiting at home, not knowing whether her mother would return in time to hold her to sleep. And then there was James Callahan, a name that made the entire New York underworld tremble with caution, who entered the restaurant with a presence that seemed to freeze the air itself. Every guest fell silent, every server held their breath. The atmosphere grew heavy under the sheer weight of his arrival. Yet what stunned everyone that night was not a weapon, nor a security detail at his side. It was a screaming infant in James's arms, a 6-month-old baby boy, his face flushed crimson, wailing in hunger and fear as though the world had just collapsed around him. In the terrifying silence that engulfed the room of the elite, Maggie did what no one else dared to imagine. She stepped forward toward the man whom every eye feared, still holding her tray of water, her heart trembling with instinct, and spoke in a voice strangely gentle for such a moment. "Sir, I am breastfeeding my own baby. If you allow me, I can feed him." Her words struck the suffocating air like a bolt of lightning, drawing every stunned gaze toward her, disbelief etched on every face. A single act born of a mother's instinct pushed Maggie into a world she had never imagined. Within minutes, she went from an invisible waitress to the only person who could calm the crime lord's child, and from that moment unfolded a strange contract to become the private caregiver for the son of a notorious kingpin, with a salary enough to change her life forever or destroy it entirely. Was this the lifeline Maggie had prayed for through countless sleepless nights, or a silent trap pulling her and her daughter into a storm with no escape? If you are listening to this story tonight, amid the familiar sounds of the city, or in a quiet corner that belongs only to you, please give us a little of your warmth by subscribing to the channel, pressing like, and sharing this story so that lives like Maggie's, like James's, like those tiny children's, can reach more hearts each day. And if you are listening from somewhere in the world, leave us a comment to tell us where you are listening from, so we may know how far this story has traveled and where you yourself are in this silent, private moment. The private room behind La Bellissima still carried the lingering warmth of the small body sleeping peacefully in Maggie's arms. The baby boy named Liam now quiet at last, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm after a long, desperate crying spell. James Callahan stood not far away, his gaze fixed on the scene before him as though he were witnessing something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. No longer the cold and commanding crime lord, but only a father seeing his child sleep in peace for the first time. When Maggie gently laid Liam back into the makeshift crib beside the chair, she could feel his eyes still following her. She turned back, straightened herself, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her wrinkled uniform, though her voice remained calm. "I will return to my work if you no longer need anything." She did not expect gratitude. She only wanted to return to her duties and fold what had just happened into a small corner of memory, like something unreal that had briefly slipped into real life. But James Callahan spoke, his voice low and hoarse, firm and unyielding. "Would you like to work for me?" Maggie stopped and turned, her brows knitting in confusion. "Work?" James stepped closer, one hand in the pocket of his expensive coat, his gaze unwavering. "I want to hire you as Liam's nanny at my home." Maggie stared at him as if he had said something too absurd to be believed. "No, I cannot. I am only a waitress." James shook his head slightly. "You are a mother, and this boy for the first time in many weeks just fell asleep in your arms. You have something that everyone I hired before did not." Maggie took a step back, her chest tightening. The offer sounded like an opportunity, yet within his calm voice lay an entire world to which she did not belong. "I have a daughter, Grace. I cannot leave her alone to care for someone else's child." "Bring her with you," James said at once. "I have space. I have means. You and your daughter will be fully provided for." Maggie felt her throat tighten. Part of her wanted to laugh at how impossibly unreal it sounded that a notorious crime lord would offer her a job as a nanny and invite her to live in his home. Yet nothing in James's eyes suggested he was joking. He was serious. Maggie shook her head. "I cannot accept. I have my job. I have my own life. You are working 2 jobs, sleeping less than 3 hours a day, and you do not know how you will pay next month's rent," James said evenly, as though he had just read her entire life from a file. "You need a way out, and I am offering you one." A quiet wave surged through Maggie's chest. He was right, far too right, and that was what frightened her most. Frightened that she might say yes, frightened that she might bring her daughter into a world she could not control, frightened that one day she would not be able to turn back. "I cannot decide now," she whispered. James nodded. "I understand. Think about it. Here is my card. Call me when you are ready." He placed a small card on the table beside the chair she had just occupied. Maggie picked it up, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes resting on the simple embossed name and a telephone number. She nodded once as if to end the conversation and turned away. As she stepped through the kitchen door, Maggie knew that something in her life had just shifted, though she could not yet tell whether it was salvation or the beginning of something from which there would be no return. It was still raining when Maggie left the restaurant, her shoes soaked and sticking to the tiled pavement, each step weighed down by the heavy thoughts in her mind. Her thin coat clung to her back with rain, but she did not bother to pull it tighter or seek shelter. In her pocket, the small business card of James Callahan felt like a cold piece of metal pressed against her chest, reminding her that everything that had happened tonight was real. She caught the last train to Jersey City, the carriage cold and nearly empty, pale lights overhead and the screech of metal wheels against the rails becoming the soundtrack to the chaos of her thoughts. She wondered whether Grace was already asleep, whether the babysitter had fed her on time or changed her diaper properly. Maggie had never liked leaving her daughter with strangers, but poverty forced her to betray her own maternal instincts. When she opened the door to her small third-floor apartment in the aging building, the hallway light flickered, damp air mixed with the smell of cooking oil from the neighboring apartment lingering in the air. The babysitter greeted her with a curt nod, took the money and left without a single question. Silence flooded the room, leaving only the rattling of the old heater in the corner and the steady breathing of Grace from the crib beside the bed. Maggie removed her coat, shook off the water and went softly to her daughter's side. She bent down, placed her hand on Grace's tiny chest, and felt each breath like a fragile thread anchoring her to reality. She sat down on the floor beside the crib, her gaze drifting into the distance. Since Grace's birth, every aspect of her life had revolved around survival, leaving no room for dreams and no time to collapse. She worked without rest, 2 jobs a day, living on instant noodles so she could afford milk for her child, sleeping less than 3 hours each night. She had never complained. But tonight, when she saw baby Liam sleeping in her arms, when she heard James Callahan say she was the only person who could make his child sleep, something inside her had shifted, not because of the tempting offer, not because of the almost unreal salary, but because of something deeper. She could not remember the last time anyone had called her necessary, not a substitute, not a number on a shift schedule, but someone no one else could replace. And yet who was James? A man from a world she had only ever known through the news, a name that made others lower their heads and look away. Was she really considering entrusting both herself and her daughter to a man like that, simply because he seemed wounded, because he knew how to speak at the exact moment she was weakest? Maggie rested her head against the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. In the darkness, Grace's soft breathing became a second heartbeat inside her. She remembered the look in James's eyes as he watched his child being fed, a gaze without defense, without power, only a completely lost father. And in that moment she realized what unsettled her was not fear but empathy. She and James from 2 different worlds, standing at the same starting line of confusion as single parents. The following morning, when the first sunlight filtered through the old window, Maggie still had not slept. The business card lay on the table beside an unwashed baby bottle. She did not know whether the coming phone call would mark the beginning of a new chapter or an irreversible mistake. But she knew one thing. Clearly she no longer had many choices left to refuse. That morning, while Grace was still sleeping soundly, Maggie sat in front of the old laptop on the narrow dining table, one hand wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, her eyes fixed on the search bar as if waiting for a door to open. She had never done this before, not for lack of curiosity, but because life had never granted her the time to pause and learn who was entering her orbit. Yet this time was different, because James Callahan was unlike anyone she had ever encountered, and his presence cut into her already anxious rhythm like a deep wound. She typed his name into the search box, and the results appeared instantly, headlines stretching across the screen. James Callahan, 36 years old, chief executive of a major private investment firm in Manhattan. But that was only the surface. Older articles and quieter forums revealed details that made her blood run cold. His name had been mentioned in federal money laundering investigations, linked to a notorious crime family from Brooklyn, and to a series of mysterious disappearances surrounding business rivals over more than 10 years. Though never formally charged, he was a name the media consistently paired with the phrase untouchable. Maggie tightened her grip on the coffee cup. She was not naive enough to misunderstand what stood before her. Yet amid the sea of information, one smaller headline made her stop. The sudden death of Emily Callahan, wife of CEO James Callahan. The article had been published barely 2 months earlier. She clicked. A photograph appeared, showing James beside a beautiful young woman, their faces radiant, their arms encircling her pregnant belly. Emily Callahan, 28 years old, a children's book writer, had died in a tragic car accident when her son was only 4 months old. One line in the article struck straight into Maggie's heart. The mother was taken too soon, leaving the infant solely in the father's care. She did not know when she had begun to breathe again. All the cold authority and pride she had seen in James suddenly became impossibly fragile. That man had lost his wife at the very moment that should have been the happiest of his life. Maggie studied the photograph again, the hope and love in Emily's eyes, and James smiling in a way entirely unlike the emotionless face Maggie had met. She closed the article and searched for more about Emily. A personal blog was still active, the final entries filled with anticipation for the impending birth. Notes about buying a crib, choosing a name for the baby boy, and small poems written for a child yet to be born. Maggie read every word, her chest growing unbearably heavy as if the weight of the world had been placed upon it. She imagined a woman preparing to welcome her first child, writing her love into words, and then vanishing forever in a single night. And James, from a husband and a father about to hold both in his arms, left with only a cry and an empty room. She glanced at her own daughter still sleeping peacefully, Grace's tiny hand gripping the blanket as if afraid of losing something. A strange sorrow rose inside Maggie. She could not imagine waking up one morning to find her child gone. No one deserved such a loss. Not Emily, not James, and certainly not Liam. Maggie closed the laptop, her eyes dark with thought. She did not know whether she was moving closer to an abyss or standing at the only true crossroads of her life. But for the first time since James had made his offer, she began to consider it as something real, not just a job, but a step into a place where she might, if only once, do something greater than herself. That afternoon, as the last sunlight quietly withdrew from the small window, Maggie sat motionless on the worn sofa, holding James Callahan's business card, her thumb tracing the raised letters as if seeking answers from the silence. She had read everything she could about him, learned of his wife's death, seen the old photographs now reduced to the remnants of a brief happiness. But more than that, she had seen the emptiness in his eyes when he looked at Liam and the desperation hidden beneath the armor of power. Grace slept on her lap, her breathing as light as morning air. Maggie looked at her a while longer, then gently laid her in the crib, picked up the phone, drew a long breath, and dialed the number. The phone rang only twice before a voice answered, low, familiar, and astonishingly calm. "Hello, this is Maggie Sullivan." A pause, then James replied without haste or surprise, "I was waiting for your call." Maggie tightened her grip on the phone, straightening her back as if he could see her posture through the line. "I have thought it through, I will agree, but with conditions." James's voice did not waver. "I am listening." Maggie swallowed. "I am not from your world. I do not work for money alone. I will only accept if I know for certain that my daughter will be safe. Grace is everything to me. If I work for you, she comes with me everywhere. No one is allowed to take her. No one is allowed near her without my consent." "Agreed." His answer came so quickly it made her hesitate. But she continued, "I will not live in some mansion and become a nanny for your entire family. I care only for Liam. I do not serve tea. I do not take orders. I do not pretend not to see what I should not see. I do not hire people to pretend. And I need the right to leave at any time. If I sense danger, if I feel that Grace is no longer safe, I will leave immediately. No bindings, no consequences." James was silent for several seconds. Then he spoke slowly, as though measuring every word. "I understand, and I agree to all of it." Maggie closed her eyes. She did not know why it felt as if she had just won a battle she never wanted to enter. "One more thing." Her voice softened but remained firm. "I want to see Liam first, in a private space. I want to know that he is truly comfortable with me. No bodyguards, no strangers watching. Just you, me, and the 2 children." James answered at once, and this time his voice carried a trace of relief that Maggie was not sure she imagined. "Agreed. I will have everything arranged. Tomorrow afternoon, a car will pick you and Grace up at 3 o'clock. Maggie nodded as if he could see it. "I will be ready." She ended the call, placed the phone on the table, and sat in silence for a long time. Part of her still could not believe she had just agreed to step into a world where all rules were rewritten by one man alone. Yet another part, deeper within her, felt strangely calm. She had set her conditions, she had drawn her boundaries, and he had accepted them all. For the first time in many months, Maggie felt as though she was reclaiming a small measure of control over her own life. She stood, walked to Grace's side, and gently brushed her hand over the soft, thin hair. "We will try, my love, just try." If anything feels wrong, I will take you away immediately. But if things are as I hope, perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a new beginning." In that small room where dreams had long been crushed beneath bills and exhaustion, hope was quietly returning, like a faint light at the end of a tunnel. The following afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the old building where Maggie and Grace lived. The driver was not wearing a suit as she had imagined, but only a black leather jacket and a knit cap, giving a slight nod when she stepped out with a small bag and a child car seat in hand. Maggie held Grace with her left arm, her right hand opening the car door, her palm icy not from the weather but from the tension threading through her veins. She had said she would try, and now words were turning into action. The car moved off, leaving the noisy city behind, crossing long bridges and winding suburban roads. The scenery gradually shifted, tall buildings giving way to bare trees in the late autumn wind, and villas appearing behind old stone fences. Maggie looked out the window, a feeling both unfamiliar and strangely peaceful rising within her. Grace slept in her mother's arms, her cheek resting against Maggie's shoulder, her tiny hand lightly gripping the safety strap as if clinging to something certain. When the car turned onto the long gravel driveway leading into the private estate, Maggie felt her heart beat faster. Through a row of ancient oak trees, a mansion came into view. It was not the ostentatious kind with marble columns and dangling chandeliers. This house carried a classical severity, dark gray brick, black-tiled roof, and wide windows draped with white curtains, exuding solidity and cold restraint, yet it was precisely that coldness that made it impossible to look away. The iron gate opened smoothly, and the car stopped at the stone steps. An elderly woman with a stern manner opened the door, nodded to Maggie, and gently took the bag from her hands. There were no inspections, no questions. Everything unfolded as if prepared long in advance. Maggie stepped into the grand foyer and paused for a moment. The ceiling was high, natural light flooding through large glass panels, the wooden floor gleaming, and the faint scent of oak, mixed with lavender oil lingering in the air. A large oil painting hung on the front wall, depicting an endless field beneath a sunset sky. Nothing was showy, yet everything carried a solemn, restrained dignity, much like the master of the house himself. James descended the left staircase, dressed simply in a white shirt and gray trousers, bearing none of the appearance of the powerful crime lord Maggie had once imagined. He looked at her and Grace, gave a slight nod, then turned to the housekeeper and said that the east wing room was to be prepared for the mother and child with everything they might need. The woman nodded and led the way. Maggie followed, her shoes sinking softly into the thick, carpeted hallway, her nerves still taut. The room prepared for her, and Grace was on the second floor, right beside what she guessed was Liam's nursery. It was unexpectedly warm, with a large bed covered in white sheets, a small crib placed by the window, a changing table, children's toys, even a wooden rocking chair beside a small bookshelf. Maggie placed Grace into the crib, the little girl blinking sleepily before closing her eyes again. Maggie looked around, unsure whether she should feel grateful or anxious. Everything had been prepared with such care and precision, as if James had not merely agreed to let her come here but wished to prove that she and her daughter were truly welcome. When she turned back, James was already standing quietly at the doorway, watching. He asked if she needed anything else. Maggie shook her head and said everything already felt more than sufficient. He nodded, gesturing toward the adjacent room and saying Liam was sleeping and he would call her when the baby woke. Maggie did not respond, only gave a small nod, and when James walked away, leaving the door slightly ajar, she released a long breath. This was no longer her home, yet neither did it feel entirely foreign. It lay on the thin boundary between trial and opportunity, between survival instinct and a hazy hope she herself scarcely dared to name. Maggie was tidying a few items in the new room when there came a very soft knock, and James's voice sounded from outside, calm as ever, saying that Liam was awake. She lifted Grace in her arms and stepped into the next room, her heart beating lightly in her chest, not so much from fear as from the sensation of crossing a strange threshold between two worlds. Liam's room was not much larger than hers, decorated in gentle tones, soft stuffed animals lined neatly on the shelves, warm yellow light cast by a small table lamp. James was holding Liam, gently rocking him, his face unable to hide a clumsiness born of inexperience. The moment Maggie entered, his gaze lifted toward her with visible relief. Liam saw the unfamiliar figure, his dark round eyes following her movement, then settling on Grace. Grace, too, opened her eyes wide, curiously observing the little boy before her as if sensing something familiar. Maggie smiled faintly, settled Grace on her lap, and stepped closer to James, her voice gentle as she asked if she might try. James nodded and carefully transferred Liam into her arms, his eyes quietly tracking every movement she made as though witnessing something sacred. At first Liam seemed hesitant, his tiny body stiff for a few seconds, but when Maggie began softly patting his back, her other hand firmly supporting his neck, the baby immediately nestled into her as if he had always belonged there. She sat down on the carpet and placed Grace beside her. The two babies, a boy and a girl only 3 months apart in age, began gazing at each other with instinctive fascination. Grace reached out and lightly touched Liam's hand, which made the little boy burst into a clear, delighted giggle. That pure laughter filled the room like a small stream flowing through stone, unexpected and pristine, and even James could not help letting out a quiet laugh. Maggie looked up and met his eyes, no longer shadowed but faintly warm. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the two children explore each other with awkward little touches and half-formed babbling sounds. Maggie felt a subtle shift, like a wall losing one brick at a time. James sat down beside her, not too close, yet no longer maintaining the cold distance he had held before. He asked softly what Grace liked most. Maggie replied that her daughter loved music and warm yellow light, that gentle melodies often lulled her to sleep. She asked in return whether Liam slept well, and James shrugged, half joking and half truthful, saying that since Emily's death, Liam seemed to sleep only when someone held him. Maggie did not ask about Emily. She knew it was a wound not yet healed, yet the way he spoke his wife's name without trembling or avoidance gave her a fragile sense of trust. When Liam nuzzled against her chest and Grace reached out to be picked up, Maggie drew the two babies closer together, and a strange yet familiar feeling welled up inside her, as if she had accidentally stepped into another version of a family she had never dared to imagine. James silently watched her manage the two little ones, his face softening, his hand resting loosely on his knee instead of clenched as usual. Maggie lifted her gaze to him. She did not know what awaited her ahead, but in this small room with two babies babbling and laughing, with a man who had endured loss and a solitary mother struggling day by day, there was something that felt like the first fragile sprout of hope. No promises, no vows, but enough to make her no longer feel lost. And perhaps, for a beginning, that was enough. Maggie began her mornings at the mansion by opening the curtains early to let sunlight flood the adjacent rooms where Grace and Liam were sleeping, needing no alarm because the mingled sounds of their giggles and soft babbling had become her natural clock, and within just 1 week, she had completely reshaped the rhythm of both children's lives, from feeding times to play hours to afternoon naps, all carefully noted on the whiteboard she taped in the kitchen, while James at first seemed bewildered when she firmly assigned him the tasks of changing diapers, warming bottles, and reading bedtime stories each night. Yet Maggie gave him no chance to retreat as she placed the bottle in his hand, showed him how to hold Liam properly, and patiently sat beside him every time his clumsiness made the baby cry simply because he held him the wrong way. And slowly the atmosphere in the house began to change from a heavy silence into the sound of life itself, with soft children's music drifting through the mornings, the scent of warm porridge filling the kitchen, Grace's bright laughter when James played peekaboo with her, and his deep voice reading fairy tales with a seriousness so earnest it made Maggie laugh more than once. And one evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Maggie stepped into the kitchen to find James awkwardly cutting fruit with such intense concentration. She would have thought he was negotiating $1 million contract, and when she teased him about preparing for a secret banquet, he simply shook his head and said that Liam had managed to eat a whole spoonful of mashed banana that day, so he wanted to prepare more to try again tomorrow, and for some reason those words tightened Maggie's chest, because she had never seen a father slice bananas with such care over so small a victory. And gradually they began sharing meals together, shy at first and later turning into a quiet routine, as Maggie cooked simple but comforting food while James set the table and poured the water and the two little ones sat in their high chairs beside them, and whenever Grace flung her spoon, James would wince as if she had spilled classified documents while Liam clapped and laughed until the table filled with sound. And one late night, Maggie awoke to a faint rustling and stepped out to see light spilling from the living room where James lay on the floor with Liam asleep on his chest, one side of his shirt soaked with the baby's drool and a fairy tale book still open in his hand. And when he looked up at her, he signaled for silence and smiled softly. And for the first time, Maggie saw him without armor or cold authority, simply a man trying to be a father, and she sat on a nearby chair watching them and then looking around the room, which no longer felt distant because small corners now held toys, children's books, bottles, and hastily folded cloths. And in that moment, for the first time since she had stepped into this house, Maggie felt something different, Not a job, not a duty, but the sensation of a home, a place that could be called home, even if only for a moment. And in that peaceful quiet, she realized she was smiling for no particular reason, other than the strange lightness and warmth in her heart, as if she had climbed one step farther out of the dark pit life had thrown her into. And perhaps this was not yet a family, but if there was anywhere to begin again, then this was the place. Yet that same afternoon, the sky turned heavy with clouds gathered thick over the hills of Westchester like an omen of something approaching, and while Maggie was rocking Grace to sleep, she heard heavy footsteps pass through the hallway, not the housekeeper and not James, whose steps were usually light. And the footsteps stopped at the end of the corridor by the door leading to James's private attic office, and she would not have paid attention had the door not closed with a weighty sound that plunged everything into silence. And later, when Grace slept deeply, Maggie laid her down gently and stepped out, intending to go to the kitchen for coffee. But as she passed the attic stairs, a low voice drifted down and made her stop. James's voice, yet not the one she knew with her and the children. For now it was hard and cold and so severe it chilled her, and though she did not mean to eavesdrop, the office door was not fully closed, and she heard him say that he had ordered silence, and that if anyone else was allowed near the estate, he would handle it personally. Then after a pause, another indistinct voice answered through the phone amid the whistle of wind through the window, and he responded that there was no agreement, that this was an order, and that if anyone asked they had never heard his name, and Maggie stood frozen as each word fell into place like a puzzle snapping shut. All the things she had read about him, the rumors of the underworld, the mysterious disappearances, the whispers the press dared not print, and her hands turned cold as if she had touched something forbidden. And she retreated quietly back to her room, closing the door behind her, though her heart still raced as she looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully, and suddenly felt that this house with its thick walls and silent corridors was hiding something, vast and dark. And through the rest of the evening, James behaved as usual, asking if Grace had eaten well, settling Liam to sleep, even making tea for Maggie. Yet that very normalcy frightened her, as she wondered how the same hands that changed diapers could give orders to erase someone without blinking, and how the same eyes that softened with tenderness over his son could be so merciless only hours before. And she sat opposite him in the living room, her teacup trembling slightly while he asked if she was all right, and she nodded and said she was only tired, though in her mind everything seemed veiled in mist as she began to question everything: the silent housekeeper, the driver who never spoke more than a sentence, the midnight calls after which James always left the room with a heavy face, and she remembered the first night she had seen him walk into the restaurant, carrying a crying baby, and how the entire room had fallen silent. And now she understood it was not only because of his wealth, but because of fear, and she went to bed unable to sleep, trapped in a labyrinth of maternal instinct, fragile trust, and a formless dread, as she wanted to believe what she saw each day: the devoted father, the man who had lost his wife and was struggling to hold onto what remained of life. Yet that low voice echoed in her mind like an unspoken verdict, and she drew her daughter closer, stroking Grace's soft hair and whispering a lullaby, knowing she could not leave yet, but also could no longer pretend she did not know that something was unfolding behind that door. And now she was no longer an outsider because she had stepped in too far to turn back. And the only question left was whether she would be strong enough to go on. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains and fell across the small crib where Grace still slept peacefully, her tiny face serene as if the outside world had never held any darkness at all. But Maggie was not the same, for she had been awake all night, unable to stop thinking about the call she had heard, about James's words and the tone in which he had given his orders, knowing she could no longer pretend she had heard nothing and knew nothing, especially when her daughter's safety was being placed on a board whose rules she did not control. And when James entered the dining room in his rolled-up white shirt and dark trousers, neat and almost harmless in appearance, Maggie was already seated at the table with Grace sleeping in the crib beside her and Liam drinking from the bottle James had just prepared, and she looked at him without smiling and without evasion, and said that they needed to talk. And James paused briefly as he set the bottle down, his eyes growing still as he asked what about, and she answered that it was about last night, and that she had heard the call, and that he knew she had heard it, her voice calm, yet every word firm and unmistakable. And James remained silent for several seconds without denial, and without immediate explanation. And she continued that she had entered this house with conditions and had accepted a part of who he was that did not belong to her. But Grace did not belong to that world, and she needed him to guarantee one thing, and she needed to hear him say it aloud, that no matter what happened, her daughter would always be safe. And he looked at her for a long time with an expression that was not anger, but something close to pain, as if she had forced him to remember something he wished to forget. and he stood and walked to the window with his back to her while Maggie did not take her eyes from him, having prepared herself to leave if necessary, while still hoping she would not have to. And James finally spoke in a low voice, no longer sharp like during the call, saying that he would never allow anyone to harm Liam, and that Grace would be the same, and that he knew he could not change the past, but he could control what happened within this house, and that he would place Grace under protection as if she were his own flesh and blood. And he turned back and stepped closer to her, not crowding her but close enough that his voice became a whisper, as he said that he knew she was afraid and that she had reason to be afraid and that he had not intended to hide everything from her forever but had not known how to explain a life like his to a woman like her. And he placed his hand on the table near hers and said that no shadow would ever be allowed to touch her or her daughter, and that was his promise. And Maggie drew a deep breath and looked down at Grace, stirring softly in her sleep. Knowing she was choosing to trust the words of a man who could make the underworld tremble, yet was also the father who did not know how to fasten a diaper and still tried to learn, the man who made her tea each night and sliced bananas simply because his son had eaten a little better. And she nodded and said nothing more, and breakfast continued as if nothing had happened. Yet within her a boundary had been clearly drawn, for she did not ask James to change and did not expect him to abandon the darkness of his past. But she needed to know, with all her pride and maternal instinct, that whatever battles might come, Grace would never be their casualty. And James in his own way understood that more clearly than any spoken vow. And that night, when the lights throughout the mansion had gone dark, leaving only the dim glow of a small lamp in the living room, Maggie stepped out after putting Grace to sleep, meaning only to get some water. But she saw James sitting alone on the long chair with his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window and his broad shoulders carrying a nameless weight. And she turned to leave until he spoke in a hoarse voice, softer than usual, saying that Emily had liked to sit right there every night when the house fell quiet. And Maggie stopped and sat in the chair opposite him without interrupting and simply waited. And James leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a few seconds, before continuing that her name was Emily, and that he had met her when she was 18, in a small Brooklyn cafe, where he was a regular and she was a clumsy waitress who spilled coffee on his shirt twice in 1 week. And he gave a faint laugh without joy as he said that she was the only person who had never been afraid of him, and that even knowing who he was and what he did, she had looked at him as a normal man, and placed her hand on his shoulder, without questioning his past or demanding explanations. And when she told him she was pregnant, he had been more frightened than he ever had in his life, believing he could not be a father and did not deserve to be one. But Emily had only smiled, and told him that he had survived dozens of terrible battles, and that fatherhood was simply another. And Maggie watched him in silence, seeing him more vulnerable than she ever had. And he went on saying that Emily had died when Liam was only 4 months old in a car accident on a night when he had been in a meeting and had not been there and had not been able to hold her one last time or say goodbye, and that Liam now had no mother, and that he had believed money could solve everything by hiring doctors and nannies. Yet Liam did not need anyone else but a mother, and he had not known how to give him that. And that every night the baby had cried until his voice broke, and each cry was another reminder of his failure to protect Emily and his failure as a father. And he lowered his head and covered his face with his hands as Maggie felt her throat tighten, and she moved to sit beside him without touching him, yet sharing the silence simply by being there. And when he looked at her again, his eyes were no longer cold but hollow with grief, as he told her that she had arrived without fear, with a child in her arms and a request no one else would dare to voice, and that she had given Liam what he could not, gentleness and warmth, and had filled the house with laughter and the scent of morning porridge and children's music, and more than that had made him believe there might be another way to live, even if only for a moment. And Maggie felt the presence of Emily in every corner of the house, in Liam's eyes and in James's fractured loneliness. But she also felt a fragile thread of hope, that from loss something new might grow, something gentle and alive. And she placed her hand lightly over his, and for the first time James did not pull away, but let it remain as an unspoken apology and a wordless thank you. And in the quiet of that night, while 2 children slept in the next room, 2 adults were learning again how to forgive themselves. Since the night James opened his heart about Emily, the atmosphere in the mansion seemed to change, as if an invisible door had been quietly opened between 2 people who had once stood in entirely different worlds. And Maggie no longer kept her guarded distance, while James no longer wore his habitual coldness. Their mornings now, beginning with the laughter of Grace and Liam echoing from the children's room and spilling into the clumsy but earnest scene of 2 adults fumbling together with bottles, food, and clothes like an awkward yet determined family, as James learned how to hold his son properly, how to tell whether Liam's cries meant hunger or fatigue or simply the need to be held, while Maggie often watched him from a distance and at times deliberately gave him space with his child, believing they needed their own time to make up for what had been lost, guiding him in wrapping the baby in a towel after a bath, in wiping a child's ears with warm water, in telling bedtime stories even if they were the simplest of tales. And once James sat on the floor with Liam in his lap, while Grace leaned against Maggie's leg as all four of them played with wooden blocks, and Maggie suddenly noticed the patience in James's hands as he fitted each piece together, his eyes carrying no burden beyond the effort to make his son laugh, and her heart softened unexpectedly, warmed by something profoundly human and real. And on one rainy afternoon when they could not go outside as usual, Maggie built a small tent from blankets and chairs, Grace and Liam crawling in and out while James sat cross-legged and was compelled to play the dragon guarding a treasure. And Maggie laughed as he growled playfully, only to be defeated by a light tap from Grace's finger on his nose, before collapsing dramatically with star-shaped stickers scattered across his face. And Maggie captured that moment on her phone for the first time, daring to keep an image of this place, because it was no longer work but life itself. And on another evening, after both children had been lulled to sleep, Maggie was washing cups in the kitchen when James entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea without invitation or ceremony, merely a familiar gesture, and they sat together at the dining table beneath the warm yellow light, with steam rising gently from the mint tea, as she told him about the nights she had spent sleepless beside Grace, and the times she had been forced to choose between buying diapers or paying the electric bill. And he listened in silence, never interrupting, only nodding now and then, or tightening his hand when her voice caught. And then he spoke of the first days caring for Liam after Emily was gone, of the heartbreaking confusion when he could not soothe his crying son, and the despair of holding him to sleep without knowing if he was doing anything right. And their connection did not arrive with noise or sudden fire but through soft, steady touches like 2 heartbeats slowly learning to speak one language after old wounds. And Maggie began to trust James not because of what he said but because of how he acted when no one watched. In the way he stood in the hallway listening to Liam's laughter, in the way he cleaned scattered toys without complaint, in the way he nervously asked her what clothes he should choose for his son's first photo. And one evening when Grace suddenly developed a fever, Maggie panicked, searching for medicine, while James gathered the little girl into his arms and soothed her with his deep, steady voice, his hand trembling lightly against her forehead. And Maggie realized he was afraid not of any danger beyond these walls, but of losing something precious in his own hands. And after that night she allowed James to hold Grace to sleep more often, while she herself held Liam's small hand and gently stroked his back when he drifted in dreams. And no one spoke of it aloud, but every small act wove an invisible thread, slowly binding all 4 of them into a family no one yet dared to name, though in Maggie's heart she understood that trust was a fragile seed, and when tended with care it could grow even through the deepest cracks of the past. And at that moment it was beginning to take root. Yet that same afternoon the sky turned quietly leaden as if foretelling what was to come, when Maggie was folding clothes in her room and James appeared at the doorway with a more solemn expression than usual and told her his mother was on her way. And Maggie paused, for she had never heard him speak of his mother directly, only in passing allusions that revealed a distance not easily bridged, and she merely nodded and returned to her task, though her hands mistakenly folded a pair of mismatched socks. And an hour later a gleaming black car stopped at the mansion gate, and a woman stepped out with a graceful yet unyielding bearing, silver hair tightly swept up, each step marked by the innate pride of one who had weathered many storms and remained standing. And James went out to meet her, but she did not embrace him, merely placed a hand on his shoulder and walked straight inside. And Maggie waited in the living room with Grace playing in the crib and Liam having just fallen asleep on a small sofa with his head resting on a cushion. And Mrs. Callahan halted when her gaze fell on Maggie, saying nothing at first while her eyes swept the room like a blade, taking measure of every detail, before stating without greeting that Maggie must be her. And Maggie rose with a faint smile and introduced herself as the temporary caregiver for both children. But James's mother did not take her hand, only inclined her head slightly and repeated the word temporary before her gaze settled on the blanket draped over Liam, who stirred softly in sleep. And Maggie saw the woman's eyes soften for just an instant, enough for her to see it, as Mrs. Callahan approached and bent slowly with a faint tremor in her hand as she brushed Liam's forehead. And Maggie silently observed, feeling she was witnessing something private and sacred, as the older woman confessed she had not visited the child since Emily's funeral, because she could not bear the thought of the girl growing up without mother and James becoming too much like his father. And when she turned to Maggie, her eyes softened further as she spoke of the boy James once had been, who had once wept over the death of an earthworm, before life hardened him in a house that had no room for weakness. and now she said she saw her grandchild sleeping peacefully in the arms of one, not of his blood, and did not know whether to feel grateful or afraid. And Maggie drew a deep breath and replied that she had not come to replace anyone but only wished Grace and Liam to grow up in a place not lacking in love, even if that place was imperfect. And Mrs. Callahan looked at her for a long time, before sitting beside Liam in silence, watching his steady breathing as rain whispered against the window, and James stood at a distance with surprise softening into relief. And when she finally prepared to leave, she paused at the door and said that the boy had slept very well, and thanked Maggie not for caring for him but for making her son listen for the first time in many years. And Maggie merely bowed her head, her heart lighter as if she had passed an unseen test she never knew she was taking. And after the door closed, James stepped beside her and touched her shoulder lightly, saying she had made his mother retreat a step, something no one had managed in more than 20 years. And Maggie smiled faintly, knowing that more important than that rare approval was the truth that even the hardest heart could not remain unmoved before a sleeping child held in the arms of genuine love. Maggie sat silently on the bed after a sleepless night while thick fog lay outside, and the pale light of morning was not enough to dispel the heavy weight in her chest. For just one day earlier, while she had been playing with Grace and Liam in the backyard, she had seen a strange man standing by the gate, neither entering nor speaking. Yet the way his eyes locked onto James when he stepped outside sent a chill straight down Maggie's spine, the gaze of someone accustomed to violence. And James, instead of showing fear or surprise, had simply stood there and returned the look in silence, as though the two men were already familiar with one another in nameless encounters. Afterward, saying nothing to her, only holding Liam tightly and making a low, urgent call to someone, and it was that silence that unsettled Maggie more than anything, for she had grown used to James being calm and reserved, but not to James concealing. And when night fell and she held Grace while sleep would not come because of what she had seen, she knew what she needed to do. So the next morning, after placing both children in the playroom and making sure no one could hear them, Maggie stepped into the library where James was reviewing documents, and he looked up with the same warmth as always. But this time she did not allow it to sway her, as she calmly said she needed to talk, and he immediately understood, closing the folder and nodding for her to continue. And she told him she knew she had chosen to step into his world, and was not naive enough to believe it was filled only with peace. But when a strange man could stand by the gate while she was playing with her daughter and he said nothing and offered no explanation, she was forced to draw a boundary for herself, and he remained silent without evasion or defense, as she went on to say she would leave, not because she hated him, and not because she doubted his love for his son, but because she could not allow her daughter to grow up in constant fear, and that she had once believed love alone could overcome everything, but now understood that even love sometimes required limits. And the silence stretched until James rose and went to the window, searching the fog beyond as if looking for something that could not be found, before turning back to her with a voice as dark and heavy as wind through a dead forest, and saying that if she left, Liam would lose one more person. The simple sentence tightening Maggie's chest as he stepped closer in slow, honest steps, and confessed he had never begged anyone for anything before. But now he was asking her to stay, not because he could not find another caregiver, but because he knew no one else could make Liam laugh the way she did, or make him feel as though he had a family, even if only for a few hours each day. And he lowered his head as if in a silent vow that he would do anything to protect her and Grace, that he would strengthen security, that he would be more transparent with her, that she could set any conditions as long as she stayed. And Maggie felt the sincerity in every word and in the eyes of a man who had already lost everything. And she did not answer at once, but went to look at Liam laughing brightly in the arms of a temporary caregiver, and then at Grace sleeping peacefully in her crib, her heart torn between the instinct of a mother who lived only to protect her child, and the heart of a woman stirred by a wounded man struggling to heal. And she nodded slowly, her voice still cautious, as she agreed to stay only as long as everything remained safe, and the moment she sensed danger, she would leave without hesitation. And James accepted without argument or negotiation, gratitude and fear both visible in his eyes, as though he himself was unsure whether he could truly keep that promise. Yet from that moment Maggie knew she was no longer staying for a job, but for a child who needed a mother, for a father who needed a second chance, and for her own heart, which despite every effort at denial had begun to anchor its beating within these walls. And then the afternoon rain fell relentlessly for hours, as if the sky itself were trying to conceal something, while Maggie was rocking Grace to sleep when the phone rang in the living room and made her freeze. For James had left early that morning for what he called an important meeting in the city without his usual security detail, carrying only a thin folder and a more somber expression than usual. And when Maggie rushed out and lifted the receiver, A strange man's voice on the other end turned her blood cold as he said James had been injured and was now at St. Luke's Hospital, and that no one else was to be informed because only this number was listed as an emergency contact, and Maggie could not remember how she had changed clothes, or how she had instructed the housekeeper to watch Grace, only that as the car sped through rain-blurred streets, a hollow space opened inside her filled with fear and suffocation, like being dragged back into a nameless nightmare, and the hospital emerged under pale white lights, and she rushed to the emergency ward where two grim-faced bodyguards blocked her path, and she could only look past them through the glass to see James lying there with a deathly pale face, his shirt stained with blood and one shoulder hastily bandaged, conscious but silent until his eyes found hers and softened, as though her presence alone was what he needed, and a tall, well-dressed man with abyss-dark eyes stepped beside her, and calmly told her this was no accident, that an ambush had taken place in the parking lot. 3 shots fired, with 1 striking James's shoulder and 2 missing, and that James had many enemies, but this time they were not targeting business but targeting him, and Maggie clenched her hands and turned to James as if seeking confirmation, and when he signaled the doctor out and softly called her name, she entered with trembling hands as he held them and apologized for exposing her to this darkness, and admitted it could no longer be hidden, and when she asked what kind of life he led that made people want him dead, he met her gaze for a long time before confessing that he did not run a company, but a network, an organization that sometimes existed outside the law, and she did not pull her hand away, only stared at him frozen as she admitted she had long suspected it yet still hoped she was wrong, and he whispered that there was no easy exit once one had entered, but that he was trying to withdraw now for Liam and for her, that he had turned down the last 2 deals, and that was why they wanted to make an example of him. And Maggie lowered her head as the world spun around her because she had never wanted blood or violence, or the underworld where rules were a luxury. Yet when she looked at James lying there with tubes in his arms still searching for her eyes, she knew this had long surpassed the boundary of a job, and she placed her hand over his heart beneath the bandages, and asked him to tell her this would never happen again, and he did not promise. Only held her hand with undisguised desperation, and swore that if there was any chance left to protect her and the children he would do it at any cost. And Maggie stood there in the sterile cold of the hospital, knowing she was stepping ever deeper into a world she had never imagined, yet also knowing that to walk away now would leave a permanent hollow in her heart she might never be strong enough to endure. Throughout the entire drive from the hospital back to the mansion, Maggie sat in silence in the back seat, holding Grace tightly against her chest, her gaze fixed not on the passing world outside but on a blank point somewhere ahead, while the driver said nothing, only occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror, as if sensing the storm gathering inside the young woman. And in Maggie's mind spun a chain of unanswered questions, how she could bring her daughter back to a place where the man at its center had just narrowly survived an assassination attempt in broad daylight, how she could lay Grace down to sleep in peace, when she herself would be sleeping with dread as her constant companion, for she was not naive. Yet motherhood was an instinct that allowed no margin for error, and the moment she stepped into the house she carried Grace straight upstairs, closed the door, drew the curtains, locked the latch, then sat beside the bed studying her daughter's sleeping face, the tiny pink lips softly pursed as if still lost in a sweet dream, and she brushed her hand through the fine strands of hair on Grace's head with a sharp ache in her heart, knowing that if anything were to happen she would never forgive herself. And that night she did not sleep, staring at the glow of her phone, reading and rereading every report about the afternoon shooting, scrolling past anonymous comments, fractured clues to an underworld James might be trapped in, each line cutting into her like a blade, painful and raw and dragging behind it an anger with nowhere to go, until in the deepest quiet when the wall clock marked time with slow, steady clicks, Maggie let the phone fall from her hand, buried her face, and whispered to herself that James might be dangerous but he had never hurt her, never once allowed Grace or Liam to be harmed, that he was part of the darkness yet also the first person who had ever made her feel as if someone truly had her back, and more than anything he was a father learning to begin again each day for a child who did not yet know how to call him father. And the next morning Maggie carried Grace down to the kitchen where the scent of coffee mingled with the lingering smell of rain, and James sat there with his arms still bandaged, his eyes shadowed as if the long night had not released him. And when he saw Maggie he rose as if to explain something, but she lifted a hand to stop him and said quietly yet firmly that she needed to speak, that she had thought all night and weighed every possibility and could no longer pretend everything was fine. Yet she also could not leave, not for money and not out of pity, but because if she ran now she would be teaching her daughter to flee from what she did not understand, and she did not want Grace to grow up in fear but to learn that trust was not foolish when placed in the right hands. And James stood silent, looking at Maggie as if truly seeing her for the first time, stepping closer and lifting his hand only to stop halfway, his voice low and bare with fear, as he confessed that he had never known what fear was until he saw her name on the emergency contact list, that he knew she could leave and that if she ever did, he would lose the last good thing left in his life. And Maggie did not take his hand, yet she nodded and said that she would not go, but he must understand that trust was fragile, and she would not have a second chance to forgive once it was broken. And James nodded, his eyes reddening, and in that moment within the old kitchen washed in soft window light there was no mafia, no danger, no blood-stained past, only two people trying to do what was right for the small lives they loved more than themselves. And Maggie knew this was not the easier choice, but sometimes what was right was not what was safest, but what gave the heart its only peace within chaos. And as she looked into James's eyes filled with fear and remorse, she chose to believe that though he came from darkness, he was trying to find his way into the light, for his children and for her. And from the day Maggie chose to stay, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted in a way difficult to explain, as James no longer disappeared into his study for hours, no longer took mysterious midnight calls or vanished without warning, but instead rose earlier, learned to change Liam's diapers without clumsiness, learned how to hold his son so his back would not bend and his belly would not grow cold, memorized feeding schedules and sleep times, even insisting on feeding him each night so Maggie could rest. And these small things that once would have meant nothing to him now became his entire world. And one morning, as Maggie prepared breakfast, she paused on seeing James seated on the living room floor, assembling a new crib for Liam while making animal sounds that sent Grace into peals of laughter. The former man who once silenced an entire restaurant with his presence now quacking like a duck with banana puree on his shirt and disheveled hair, yet looking happier than he ever had since she met him. And the changes were not only in daily routines, for one night while Maggie rocked Grace to sleep, she heard voices from the library, and though she did not mean to listen, she caught the name Santos and the words $1 million deal, and James's voice was steady and unyielding as he said he was done, that he was pulling out, that he would not raise his son in a world he himself could not live within. And after a brief silence, he repeated more heavily that if the man on the other end did not accept it, then he should never call again, followed by the hard click of a phone set down. And Maggie said nothing the next morning. Yet when James brought coffee into the kitchen with wet hair and rolled-up sleeves holding Liam in one arm, he studied her for a long moment and quietly asked if she had heard, and she nodded, and he confessed he had turned down the largest deal in 3 years, a retreat and a risk, but that he could no longer live two lives at once, could not be both a father and a man with nothing to lose. And Maggie said nothing, only stepped forward to straighten the small bow on Liam's shirt, a simple gesture carrying 1,000 words of understanding. And in the days that followed, James contacted lawyers to move much of his wealth into legitimate channels, began meeting with partners outside the underworld, seeking to invest in education, establishing a small fund in Emily's name to support struggling single mothers. And Maggie did not know how far he could truly go in washing the past clean, but she knew he was trying in earnest, learning to listen instead of command, learning to fold children's clothes, learning to patiently explain to Grace why a ball could not belong in the refrigerator. And one afternoon, as the family played outside, James turned to Maggie with an unfamiliar gentleness, and in a low, sincere voice, said he did not know if everything could ever be fully purified, but if he had a chance to begin again, he wanted that beginning to be with her. And Maggie did not answer with words. Yet when she leaned her head against his shoulder while Liam and Grace laughed across the grass, she knew that for this moment, at least she had been right to trust a man who had once been lost in darkness, but was now searching for the path back into the light. 1 month later, as the last strands of sunlight slipped through the treetops and bathed the backyard of the mansion in gold, James and Maggie sat on the old oak bench, his hand resting lightly along the back of the seat behind her while the two children sprawled on the grass playing with their toys, the breeze carrying the faint fragrance of wild roses along the fence, gentle as the moment itself. And James watched Grace laugh as Liam tugged at a cloth bear before turning to Maggie, his voice low and unhurried as if afraid of shattering the fragile peace between them, telling her that she had been here for some time now, and that although nothing was perfect, he could see how the 3 adults and the 2 little ones were gradually moving in a single rhythm. And Maggie turned to him, caution still visible in her eyes despite their softness, and after a brief silence, James drew a small envelope from his pocket and placed it in her palm, inside a key and a simple slip of paper, with the address written beneath a handwritten line that read, "Your home if you choose." And she looked at the key, then at him, and said quietly that she still had her own home, and he nodded as if he had expected that answer. saying he was not forcing her and only wanted her and Grace to know that this was not merely a temporary shelter but could become a true home if she wished. And Maggie closed her fingers around the cold metal, feeling its weight sink into her skin. For she had thought of this more than once. Of moving fully, of living as a family with 2 children and a man struggling to cleanse his past. Yet the shadow of fear still stretched long from wounds James had not fully revealed. And she had never known complete peace, but at least she had always retained her own agency. And here, if everything were to fall apart one day, would she truly be strong enough to leave again with her child? And she drew a deep breath and spoke softly so only James could hear that she was not saying no, but that she needed more time. Needed to be sure that this place was truly safe, not just today but in the days to come. Needed to know that he was changing not only for the children or out of guilt, but because he himself truly wished to live differently. And James nodded slowly with no disappointment in his eyes, only understanding. For though patience was not a trait he had ever known, he was learning to step back for Maggie, and he reached out and gently took her hand, saying he could wait and only needed her not to give up on him. And Maggie smiled, her nod a wordless promise, while the children's laughter rang out before them, and the sun melted behind the trees. And though uncertainty still lived in her heart in that moment, as James's hand tightened around hers, and his gaze met hers without flinching, she knew she was still walking the right path, slowly perhaps, but truthfully, and what is true is always worth waiting for. And mornings in Westchester began with the soft sounds of nature and the clear laughter of the 2 children. As Maggie brewed coffee in the kitchen, and the aroma drew James in with Liam in his arms, sucking on a pacifier while Grace sat in, her high chair patting the table and demanding mashed bananas, her eyes lighting up each time her mother turned back, and James bent to kiss Grace's hair before settling Liam into his chair, and then looked to Maggie as if his eyes had already learned to search for her first each day. And after breakfast, all 4 went out to the garden where James lifted Liam onto his shoulders, and the boy squealed with delight, while Maggie spread a large blanket beneath the tree and brought a small basket of toys, including the stuffed bear Grace could not sleep without, and the children crawled about, played, squabbled, grabbed and then laughed again as if the world needed nothing more than that. And Maggie lay on her side on the blanket watching her daughter toddle toward James, reaching out with a happy babble that sounded strangely like Dada, a sound that struck the man motionless. As he lifted the little girl and met Maggie's eyes, knowing in that instant his heart had tilted another beat for a child not of his blood. And the morning passed like a slow-moving film, as James guided Liam's small legs on the grass, teaching him to stand, while Maggie told Grace stories in a warm, low voice with sunlight glittering through the leaves on her hair, and from a distance they looked like a complete family, a small haven tucked just beyond the borders of a loud, chaotic world. Yet even in that peace Maggie felt something fragile hovering over them. Not a defined fear, but a vague unease, like a beautiful dream that might vanish if someone woke too soon. And near noon, James received a call, and though he spoke only a few brief words before ending it, Maggie saw his hand tighten and his jaw harden, and he returned as if nothing had happened, still laughing when Liam pulled his hair. Yet she read in his eyes a weight not yet spoken, and when the children fell asleep for their nap, Maggie brewed 2 more cups of coffee and took them to the back porch where James sat staring toward the far line of trees, and he accepted the cup and after a sip asked without looking at her if she regretted it, and she sat beside him, turning the mug slowly in her hands and asked what he meant. And he answered that he meant stepping into his life and allowing her daughter to grow up beside a man like him. And Maggie met his gaze, and said gently but firmly that she did not regret stepping in, but that she was afraid. Afraid that the most beautiful things might not last. Afraid that one day they would no longer be able to shield the children from what was approaching beyond their control. And James was silent a long while before nodding and admitting that he too was afraid. Afraid every time a loud car passed the gate. Afraid when she went out without security. Afraid of the day Liam would ask who his mother was. And Maggie took his rough, calloused hand in hers and did not promise that everything would be all right, but said she was here day by day, step by step, not running. And sometimes that was enough to soften fear, and they sat together in a silence that needed no words, while at their feet the 2 children slept like small seedlings freshly watered. And no one knew what tomorrow would bring, but at least for today they still had one another. They still had sunlight. And laughter still lingered in a place that once had known only shadows. That night the rain fell softly, not violent but steady enough for droplets to kiss the large living room windows where Maggie stood motionless, one arm wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, gazing out into the garden, soaked beneath the warm yellow lights where she had once laughed with James and the 2 children under a gentle afternoon sun, everything seeming still there, the breath of peace feeling close and almost tangible yet fragile enough to ache. With Grace and Liam already asleep, James silent in the library, and only her alone by the window facing the questions her heart had yet to answer, for she had stepped into this world through a single impulsive act born purely of maternal instinct, nourishing another child in the midst of a luxury restaurant, never imagining it would become the beginning of a journey torn between hope and peril. And James was no longer the man who terrified her, yet not entirely the one she could trust without reserve, standing instead on the boundary between two worlds, just as Maggie now walked the tightrope drawn between reason and feeling, wondering whether his change was real or only temporary, whether she was walking into his redemption or being pulled into a vortex with no escape, whether a man who had lived in darkness could ever truly step into the light, and whether a mother who had once been paralyzed by fear could learn to love again. And yet when she turned her gaze toward the dim hallway, where the bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and two small lives slept in peaceful innocence, she understood one truth that needed no immediate certainty, that some steps must be measured in trust and time, and in a love strong enough to cross old scars. And Maggie's story was not a fairy tale with a white horse prince or distant magic, but the story of an ordinary woman weary, brave, and overflowing with love, who chose to step forward for her child, for a chance, and perhaps for a feeling quietly growing within her heart. And for you who are watching this video now, have you ever stood before a window like Maggie did? Have you ever wondered whether you were stepping into light or shadow? Have you ever hoped for something that once seemed impossible? And if this story has touched something within your heart, please leave a comment and share your most honest thoughts and feelings, because we always wish to listen to you. For every story is a fragment of life, and perhaps it is you who will become the inspiration for thousands of others. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you will not miss the moving and meaningful stories we share each day. Please press like and share if today's story has stirred your emotions, and introduce it as well to those you love, so they too may listen to something beautiful. Thank you for accompanying us throughout this journey, and may you and your family always be blessed with good health, peace, happiness, and a full life each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.